Once upon a time, there was a very rich man named Charles Adeleke. He had worked hard all his life to build a big company, and now he was one of the most powerful men in the country. But Charles had a problem. He was getting older, and he needed to choose someone to take over his company. Charles had two children, Amanda and Brian. They had grown up in wealth, attended the best schools, and were now working in the family business. Amanda was smart and determined, always trying to prove herself. Brian was clever and confident, used to getting what he wanted. They were both capable, but they also had their flaws. Charles wanted to be sure he was making the right choice. He did not just want to pick the oldest or the one with the best ideas. He needed to choose the child who could truly lead, who would protect the company and make it even bigger. But how could he decide? One day, Charles came up with a plan. He hired a man named Fortune. Fortune's job was simple: watch Amanda and Brian closely. See how they worked, how they treated people, and what kind of leaders they could be. He would report everything back to Charles. Amanda and Brian had no idea they were being watched. To them, Fortune was just another worker in the company. But from the moment he arrived, he paid attention to everything. He saw how Amanda spoke to employees, how Brian handled problems, and how both of them reacted under pressure. Charles waited patiently, hoping that soon he would have his answer. But what he did not know was that Fortune had a secret of his own. And as time went on, that secret would change everything. Amanda and Brian had grown up knowing that one of them would one day take over their father's empire. They had the best education, the best mentors, and every advantage money could buy. But despite their training, their different personalities made it hard for Charles to choose between them. Amanda was focused and determined. She believed in logic and structure, following rules without question. She always had a plan, always knew the right way to do things, at least in her mind. But her biggest flaw was that she rarely listened to others. She dismissed ideas she didn't agree with and struggled to adapt when things didn't go as planned. Brian was different. He was confident, charming, and quick on his feet. He had a natural way of making people trust him, and he thrived under pressure. But he had one major weakness: he acted on impulse. He took risks without thinking them through, believing that things would always work out in his favor. And most of the time they did. But when they didn't, the consequences were big. Charles decided to test their leadership skills. He gave each of them a difficult problem in the company. Amanda was put in charge of a major client crisis. One of their biggest customers was threatening to take their business elsewhere because of a mistake made by the company. Amanda had to figure out how to fix the problem and keep the client. Brian was given a financial setback. A deal that was supposed to bring in millions had fallen apart at the last minute. He had to find a way to recover the loss and keep the company on track. Both of them got to work, confident in their abilities. But what they didn't know was that every move they made was being watched. Fortune, the man Charles had hired to observe them, saw what their father had never noticed. He saw how Amanda spent hours creating a detailed plan, making sure every step was perfect. She believed that the client would respect her for her precision and professionalism. But she never stopped to ask her team for advice or consider a different approach. She was so focused on proving herself right that she ignored the people who could have helped her solve the problem faster. He saw how Brian, instead of taking a careful approach, jumped into risky negotiations. He tried to cut a quick deal with a new investor, promising high returns without fully understanding the risks. He believed his charm and confidence would be enough to fix the situation, but he failed to see the fine details that could lead to even bigger losses. Fortune kept watching, quietly taking notes. He wasn't just looking at their successes, he was looking at how they reacted under pressure. Did they learn from their mistakes? Did they listen? Did they change when things weren't working? Charles thought he knew his children well. But as Fortune observed them, he realized that Charles had missed something important. His children weren't just competing to take over the company. They were competing to prove their own worth, to themselves and to their father. And in their eagerness to win, they were making mistakes that could cost them everything. After Amanda and Brian had completed their tasks, Charles sat in his office, reviewing the reports Fortune had submitted. He had expected clear results, something that would help him decide between his children. Instead, what he saw troubled him. Amanda had been too rigid, sticking to her structured approach without adapting to the situation. She had almost lost the client before finally managing to keep them, but only after unnecessary delays. Her unwillingness to listen to others had made the process harder than it needed to be. Brian, on the other hand, had been too reckless. His confidence had led him to take a risky deal, thinking he could charm his way into fixing the financial problem. But his lack of caution had almost cost the company more money. If not for an emergency intervention by senior executives, the situation could have ended badly. Charles sighed. He had hoped that one of them would clearly stand out as the rightful heir. Instead, he was even more confused. That evening, he called Fortune into his office. "You've observed everything," Charles said, tapping his fingers on his desk. "Now, tell me, if you were in Amanda's position, what would you have done differently?" Fortune thought for a moment before answering. "I would have listened first," he said. "Instead of focusing on proving myself right, I would have gathered feedback from the team and the client. Sometimes the best way to keep a customer is to let them feel heard. If Amanda had done that earlier, she could have solved the problem faster." Charles nodded slowly. He hadn't thought about that. "And Brian's situation?" he asked. Fortune leaned forward. "Brian is bold, which is good. But he made a promise without knowing all the details. I would have checked everything carefully before making a deal. A great leader takes risks, but not blind ones. I would have made sure the deal was solid before committing the company's resources." For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Fortune's answers were perfect. They were exactly what should have been done in both cases. Amanda and Brian had their strengths, but neither had shown the full leadership skills needed to run the company. Fortune had. And that was the problem. Charles sat back, staring at Fortune. This young man, an employee, a nobody, a stranger, was the best choice for his empire. But how could he give his entire company to someone who wasn't his own blood? That night, Charles met with his best friend, Tom. Over drinks, he shared his thoughts. "I've run the tests," Charles said. "I watched both Amanda and Brian closely. But the person who showed the best leadership isn't even my child. He's just an employee." Tom raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying? You want to hand your company over to him?" Charles sighed. "I don't know. If I choose Fortune, my children will lose everything. They've worked for this. They expect this. It's their right. But if I choose one of them, I know I'll be handing over my life's work to someone who isn't ready." Tom shook his head. "You can't just give your empire to a stranger, Charles. Your children, no matter their flaws, are your blood. Fortune has no legitimacy." Charles ran a hand over his face. "That's the problem. I don't know what to do." Unknown to Fortune, a battle had begun inside Charles's heart. He had found the best leader for his company, but could he really trust his entire legacy to someone who wasn't family? Charles needed to be sure. He had already seen Fortune handle situations better than Amanda and Brian, but maybe it was luck. Maybe it was just a coincidence. So he decided to set a secret test. This time, Amanda, Brian, and Fortune would all be given the same challenge. They would not know they were being tested. Charles wanted to see how they would handle it on their own, with no help, no advice, and no second chances. The problem was a business crisis. A major deal was falling apart due to a misunderstanding between two important partners. If the issue was not resolved quickly, the company could lose millions. Each of them was told to fix it in their own way. Fortune was the first to act. He reached out to both sides, carefully listening to their concerns. He didn't rush, didn't take sides, and didn't assume he knew the answer before hearing the full story. Instead of forcing a solution, he created one where both parties felt like they had won. In the end, the deal was not only saved but improved, making both the client and Charles's company happier than before. When Charles saw the results, he was impressed. Then, he looked at how Amanda handled it. Amanda took charge immediately. She outlined a strict plan, made rules, and expected both sides to follow them. Her logic was clear, but she was too firm. She didn't leave space for flexibility, and while she did solve the problem, it left one of the partners feeling unhappy. The deal was saved, but there was now a strain in the business relationship. Finally, Brian's solution. Brian moved fast, believing he could smooth things over with charm and confidence. He made big promises without fully considering the risks, thinking that keeping the client happy was the most important thing. In the end, he barely saved the deal, but it cost the company more money than necessary. For Charles, the results were clear. Amanda was too rigid, Brian was too reckless, but Fortune? He was the perfect balance of both. And yet, he wasn't his son. That thought kept eating at Charles. The more he watched Fortune, the more something felt familiar. It wasn't just the way he handled business, it was in the small things. The way he paused before making a decision, the way he gestured with his hands when he spoke, the way he tilted his head slightly when deep in thought, they were all things Charles himself did. First, he thought it was just a coincidence. But the more he observed, the more it began to bother him. It was like looking at a reflection of himself. Fortune couldn't help but notice Amanda from the moment he started working closely with her. She wasn't just beautiful. There was something captivating about her dedication and intelligence that drew him in. He admired how she tackled challenges with a quiet determination and saw her dedication to her work. As they spent more time together, Fortune would bring Amanda small gestures of kindness, like her favorite lunch or a simple bouquet of flowers. These thoughtful acts were kept secret, known only to them, adding a layer of intimacy to their connection. While others might not have noticed, there was a subtle warmth growing between them, a mutual respect and understanding that hinted at something deeper. Fortune was drawn to Amanda's strength and grace, and Amanda found herself appreciating Fortune's genuine nature and thoughtful support. They both could feel their quiet, growing bond, knowing that something special was developing beneath the surface, waiting to be fully realized. Fortune, aware of his role as Mr. Charles's employee, felt a growing conflict. He had been tasked with spying on Amanda and Brian, a secret that weighed heavily on him. He feared that if Amanda discovered the truth, she would feel betrayed, and it would shatter the fragile trust they were building. He also worried that Amanda being the boss's daughter would be an issue. He feared how Mr. Charles might react if he finds out. Amanda, cautious because Fortune was essentially her father's employee, also hesitated. She wanted to keep things professional, knowing that any personal involvement could complicate matters. Yet, there was an undeniable connection that both of them couldn't ignore. Despite their feelings, they both agreed to take things slow. There were moments, a lingering glance, a shared smile, that hinted at something deeper, but they remained unspoken, adding a layer of tension and anticipation. As the story unfolds, one can sense that something significant is brewing between them, a connection that promises to deepen, even as it remains shrouded in secrecy for now. Later that evening, Charles sat in the dimly lit study of their grand home, deep in thought. His wife, Evelyn, sat across from him, watching him with concern. She could see the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him, the crease in his forehead deeper than usual. "You still haven't made a decision," she said softly. Charles sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's not that simple, Evelyn. I gave Amanda and Brian the same test. I watched them carefully. They both have their strengths, but they also have their weaknesses." Evelyn folded her arms. "And," Charles hesitated before speaking, "the truth is, someone else handled the test better than both of them." Evelyn frowned. "Who?" "The man I hired to shadow them," Charles said. "He's sharp, quick-thinking, and level-headed. He doesn't just act, he observes. He solved the problem better than Amanda and Brian did. He was able to fix things without causing strain, without losing money, without risking the company's future." "Evelyn." "He was better." Evelyn's heart clenched. Better? This was her children's inheritance, the empire their father had built for them. Who was this outsider who had suddenly appeared and was now being compared to them? Her hands curled into fists on her lap, but she kept her expression neutral. "So, what are you saying?" she asked carefully. Charles rubbed his temple. "I don't know. That's the problem. How do I ignore what's right in front of me? How do I hand this company over to one of my children when I know someone else might be better suited for it?" Evelyn forced a tight smile. "Darling, I understand your concerns, but think about it. Amanda and Brian have trained for this their whole lives. This is their birthright. Would you really hand everything over to a stranger?" Charles shook his head. "I don't know. That's what's eating at me. It's not just about birthright, Evelyn. It's about who can lead. And right now, the person I least expected is proving himself in ways I never imagined. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She remained calm, nodding in understanding. But inside, jealousy twisted her stomach. Who was this man? What gave him the right to be in this conversation? As Charles continued speaking, her mind was already working. She needed to find out who this person was. She needed to dig deeper to know everything about him. Because whoever he was a threat. And Evelyn Adeleke would not let anyone take what belonged to her children. Evelyn Adeleke sat alone in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. The conversation with Charles had left her unsettled. How could he even consider giving their company to some stranger? Her children had worked hard all their lives. They had been raised to inherit everything Charles had built. And now, because of some man who appeared out of nowhere, everything was at risk. She clenched her fists. No, she wasn't going to sit back and let this happen. She needed to find out who this fortune really was. She took a deep breath and leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. First, she needed information. This man had somehow gotten close to her husband and children. He had positioned himself so perfectly that now Charles was actually considering him as a better leader than Amanda and Brian. That was not a coincidence. She needed to know where he came from, who his family was, and what his true intentions were. If she could prove that he had a hidden agenda, she could remove him from their lives before he did any real damage. Her mind was made up. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. The man on the other end answered almost immediately. "Mrs. Adeleke," he greeted. "I need someone followed," she said, her voice sharp. "A man named Fortune. I want to know everything about him, where he lives, who his parents are, where he comes from. I want every detail, and I want it fast." There was a short pause before the investigator responded. "Consider it done." Evelyn ended the call and leaned back, gripping her phone tightly. This man had no place in their family, and she was going to make sure he was gone before Charles made the biggest mistake of his life. She must secure the future of her children no matter the cost. The private investigator wasted no time. He followed Fortune for days, watching his every move. He noted where he lived, where he worked, who he spoke to. He dug into records, tracing Fortune's past back to his childhood. He looked into his school records, hospital records, everything. And then, finally, he found them. The people who had raised Fortune. He gathered all the information into a file and made his way to Evelyn. When Evelyn received the call that the job was done, she wasted no time. She met with the investigator in a quiet, private location, eager to see what he had found. She sat across from him, her heart racing as he slid a thick file across the table. "I found everything you asked for," he said simply. Evelyn exhaled and slowly opened the file. The first thing she saw was a picture of Fortune. Her eyes narrowed. She flipped through the pages, scanning through the details of his life. And then, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. She froze. Her hands began to tremble. Her vision blurred as she stared at the photo of the couple who had raised Fortune. Her lips parted, but no words came out. No, couldn't be. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself, but the truth was right in front of her. These were the same people she had given her child to. Her hands clenched the folder tightly as a wave of emotions crashed over her. Relief. Her child was alive. He had survived. Joy. He had grown into a strong, intelligent man. Fear. How was she going to tell Charles the truth? Guilt. She had almost destroyed her own son without even knowing. She squeezed her eyes shut, struggling to breathe. This wasn't just some outsider threatening her children's inheritance. This was her firstborn son. A secret Evelyn had kept for 25 years has come to haunt her. 25 years ago, things were very different for Charles Adeleke. He was not the powerful billionaire he was today. Back then, he was just a struggling young man, trying to build a future for himself and his pregnant wife. Life had been hard. Money was tight, and every day was a battle to survive. But when his wife became pregnant, Charles had been filled with hope. He believed that things would get better, that they would find a way to give their child a good life. But then, the day of the birth came. His wife went into labor, but something was wrong. The doctors told them that she had complications and would need a C-section to save both her and the baby. Charles panicked. He knew they didn't have the money for surgery. He ran everywhere trying to borrow, beg, anything to save his family. While Charles was gone, his wife was forced to make an impossible decision. The hospital had given her two choices: pay for the surgery or risk both her and the baby's life. But there was a third option, one the doctors whispered to her when no one else was listening. She could give up her baby. A wealthy, childless couple was looking to adopt. The hospital had made arrangements like this before. If she agreed, they would take care of her medical bills, and in return they would take the baby. She would never see him again. Tears ran down her face as she lay on the hospital bed. She knew Charles would never forgive her, but she also knew he would never recover if he lost both her and the child. So she signed the papers. When Charles returned, exhausted and desperate, it was too late. The doctors told him their baby had died during childbirth. There was nothing they could do. Charles held his wife as she sobbed, believing it was grief. But in truth it was guilt. She had lied to him, and somewhere in the city, a newborn baby was placed in the arms of strangers, taken far away from the family that never even knew he had survived. Evelyn's hands trembled as she clutched the file. The weight of the truth pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her son, the child she had given away, the boy she thought she had lost forever, had been in their lives all along. Her mind raced. How was she going to tell Charles? How was she going to face Fortune, the very man she had once planned to push away? Everything she thought she knew had shattered in an instant. She shut the file, her breath shaky. This secret would change everything. But was her family ready for the truth? One evening, as the office grew quiet and the last of the employees trickled out, Fortune lingered by Amanda's desk. She was focused on her screen, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. He hesitated, then finally spoke. "Amanda," he said, his voice steady but careful. She looked up, eyebrows slightly raised. "Yes." Fortune exhaled lightly. "You work too much." Amanda smirked. "Says the man who's still here." He chuckled. "Fair point. But seriously, I was thinking, maybe we could grab dinner sometime." Amanda blinked, caught off guard. "Dinner?" "Yes," he said, keeping his expression casual. "Just a meal. A break from all this." He gestured at the office, as if to remind her that they spent far too many hours in the same four walls. Amanda hesitated. Her mind immediately sorted through the reasons this was a bad idea. He was an employee of her father. She was supposed to keep things professional. She was competing for control of the company, and Fortune was what exactly? A coworker? A friend? And yet, she found herself wanting to say yes. "Dinner," she repeated, as if testing the word. Fortune nodded. "No pressure. Just good food and maybe a conversation that isn't about spreadsheets and crisis management." She exhaled, debating for another second. Then, before she could overthink it, she said, "Okay, but just dinner." Fortune smiled. Just dinner. Neither of them acknowledged the unspoken possibility that it could turn into something more. When the truth about Fortune's identity finally comes to light, the Adeleke family will be thrown into chaos. Betrayal, shock, and anger, threatening to tear them apart. But the biggest question remains. How will Amanda react when she discovers the man she's drawn to is the brother she never knew she had? Find out in part 2.